Hello, everyone, and thank you for joining Pittsburgh Theological Seminary in the month of October for Hearing History, Seeing Activism, a series of programs that consider the unheard narratives in our communities and congregations. Tonight's program is co-sponsored by the World Mission Initiative, Continuing Education, the Miller Summer Youth Institute, the Metro Urban Institute, the Center for Adaptive and Innovative Ministry, the Kelso Museum, the Office of Field Education, the Office of Alumni Relations, and the Barber Library. As we welcome our new president, Reverend Dr. Asa Lee, to PTS, we invite you to add your voice to conversations that will focus on the local, national, and international stories that shape who we are. This evening, we welcome Dr. Kimberly Hill into this conversation. My colleague Scott Hagley will provide a more substantial introduction to our guest in just a few minutes. And we encourage you to view the whole list of October events. A quick link to the calendar is available on the PTS homepage at www.pts.edu, or you could find your nearest PTS community member and look at the back of their t-shirt. My name is Helen Blyer, and I have the privilege of serving here as the Director of Continuing Education. Before we begin with our program, I'd like to remind you of a few housekeeping details, although we are all very Zoom fluent these days. We are meeting in webinar, which means, of course, that only the presenters are visible on camera. If you have questions that arise during our session, please include them in the Q&A pod only. We'll have ample time for questions and answers at the end. Please use Q&A. If you put them in the chat, they will get lost. Please use the chat pod, on the other hand, robustly to comment on the talk, to communicate with each other, and generally engage with the presentation. In fact, you can give it a test drive right now. Please open up the chat pod, say hello, and post your name and where you are viewing this from. And for those of you who would benefit from this service, please note there is a new Zoom feature, closed captioning, otherwise known as live transcription. It's already been activated. To use it, simply click on the button at the bottom of your screen. For those of you who are on mobile devices, it's already turned on for you. And please remember, tonight is part 1 of 2 in our McClure Lecture series. We'll have our second session next Wednesday, same time, same Zoom link, and recordings of each event will be available early the following week. We invite you to use these and other recordings we have available in our archive with your church adult ed programs, with your book groups, and other gatherings. And now I will happily turn the screen over to my colleague, Dr. Scott Hagley, who serves here at PTS as our Associate Professor of Missiology. Scott will introduce our program co-sponsor and our speaker. Scott, welcome. It's good to have you here.
Thank you, Helen. Welcome, everybody near and far to this year's McClure Lecture. It's been fun watching in the chat, people checking in where they are coming from. It's really great having people from so many places here with us, and we're really looking forward to hearing from Dr. Hill tonight. The McClure Lecture is a lecture held in honor and memory of the Reverend W. Donald McClure, who graduated from Westminster College in New Wilmington, Pennsylvania, and went immediately to serve as a teacher in Khartoum, Sudan. After returning to the States, he attended Pittsburgh Theological Seminary, where he graduated and was ordained as a Presbyterian minister. And with his wife, Lida, was commissioned as a missionary of the United Presbyterian Church of North America. He was sent to Dalab Hill in the Republic of Sudan. McClure, after some time, began to question the traditional missionary approach to indigenous people and raised significant financial support from congregations across the UPNA. In 1938, he initiated a new mission with the Anuak people in Akobo, Sudan, and across the border in Pokwo and Gilo, Ethiopia. The resulting Anuak project has continued ever since. Don McClure was tragically shot and killed by guerrillas in eastern Ethiopia on March 27, 1977. Former Pittsburgh Theological Seminary professor of church history, Dr. Charles Partee, has written a biography of Don McClure that details his life and his missiological focus. So it's my privilege tonight to introduce for you the Dr. Kimberly D. Hill, who's a historian of African-American missions and Black internationalism. Dr. Hill teaches US and African-American history at the University of Texas at Dallas. Her PhD in history is from the University of North Carolina at Chapel Hill. And her research and teaching career has brought to light an often neglected stream of mission history, African-American missionaries sent by Protestant denominations to Africa. Her recent book is A Higher Mission, The Careers of Alonzo and Althea Brown Edmiston in Central Africa. And the title of her lecture this evening is Christian Justice, Exploitation, and Racial Violence from Red Rubber to Bloody Sunday. So here's the point where if we were all in person, I would say, please join me in offering a warm welcome to Dr. Kimberly Hill. So we can maybe quietly clap on our screens. So Dr. Hill, welcome to the McClure Lectures.
Thank you so much, Dr. Hadley. I'm very happy to be here, and thank you for the introduction. Very happy to see everyone's introductions in the chat as well, and to all the familiar faces. Thank you for joining us tonight. I've made a presentation for you, so I'm going to share the screen.
That's good.
So we are going to start out our discussion of Christian justice, exploitation, and racial violence from Red Rubber to Bloody Sunday by talking about current events. I've brought 16 photographs to share with you to navigate us through this very long, complicated story of the connections between Christians' discussions of justice and exploitation and racial violence. But our opening photograph comes from Black Lives Matter Plaza in Washington, DC. So this is part of 16th Street Northwest in DC. And just at the end of the block, you can see the White House. And you can also see the site of St. John's Episcopal Church. I visited the plaza in May of this year, and I carried with me 2 roses. I left a rose in honor of the 2 ministers from St. John's Episcopal Church who were tear gassed while they were passing out water to the protesters who had gathered here to mourn the deaths of Breonna Taylor and George Floyd. I left another rose here where my mother is standing in memory of the pain of the people who were beaten by officials, tear gassed and beaten for standing inside Black Lives Matter Plaza. So the protesters are gone, but you can still see the word matters in big block letters going down the road. I carried home with me the memories of how the term justice has become important for defining either side of the controversy over Black Lives Matter. Those against the Black Lives Matter movement face accusations of dehumanization, of thinking that people's pain, their grief, their suffering can be ignored or overlooked, or that it's less important than other concerns. Those for the Black Lives Matter movement face accusations of criminality or recklessness or a disregard for law and order. Academic and ministerial efforts to speak into this context need to address the emotions as well as the relevant facts that are guiding the debate on either side of this controversy. We can look to historic examples of how American ministers have established and questioned their own emotional stakes around the legacies of slavery. And there's a long history of American Christian outreach being motivated by concerns about racial violence. I'm going to share some of that history with you this evening, based especially on examples from my first book, which is called A Higher Mission. This history is complicated by evidence that the intentions behind some Christian outreach that is meant to respond to racial violence did not automatically preclude further violence or avoid further exploitation. So we're going to look at some reasons why and look at different ways that missionaries to Congo tried to define justice through their work. Well, before I start talking about the missionaries to Congo specifically, we're going to talk about the context of American slavery with an introduction to the exodusters. So exodusters was a phrase used to refer to formerly enslaved people who were creating their own biblical style exodus. They were leaving the places where they had been forced to work. They were taking whatever supplies they had. They were gathering as many relatives as they could find. They were going to start fresh somewhere. That was their definition of freedom. That was part of their search for justice in the aftermath of slavery. The exodusters also became very adamant about founding and supporting education. So part of the exodusters story is of the people moving into the West, some moving into the North, some of them staying in the US South, moving into urban areas and establishing historically Black colleges and universities. In that process of them trying to promote education through establishing Black colleges, through establishing schools, by making sure that children and adults were gaining literacy at remarkable rates. Part of that process was them also facing violent backlash for that initiative, facing attacks, frequent efforts to burn down schools, to destroy Black colleges. The American Missionary Association was one of the white American organizations that was involved in supporting and cooperating with exodusters, with formerly enslaved people who were going to face the physical risks, face the economic sacrifices, do whatever was necessary to ensure that they could provide an education and what they hoped would be a better quality of life and an independent future for the next generations. The American Missionary Association established historically Black colleges, including Talladega College and Fisk University. And the American Missionary Association also helped to fund many of the faculty members who worked for these Black colleges. With exodusters fleeing the fields of the US South, the question of what was going to happen with the cotton economy became key to thinking about this issue of the history of Christian justice and exploitation. So even though slavery was legally abolished with the 13th Amendment, the desire to maintain a cotton economy lasted for decades. And different strategies for maintaining that cotton economy generally relied on an expectation that people of African descent would be encouraged or compelled to continue working in cotton fields. The desire to maintain this economy through underpaid, sometimes incarcerated labor, this became a cultural issue that also had academic influences, also had religious influences. The missionaries that I'm going to be talking about tonight were part of the Presbyterian Church in the United States, or the Southern Presbyterian Church. The Southern Presbyterian Church had formerly been the Church of the Confederate States. And after the Civil War ended, it remained part of Southern Presbyterian principles to separate social or economic issues from theology, to argue that it should not be the role of the church to speak to what was considered secular issues such as slavery. In the aftermath of the Civil War, that translated to the Southern Presbyterian Church starting a seminary for African-American ministers, training African-American men to become pastors and start their own churches. But noticeably, without any indication that the denomination was going to encourage ministers to try to change people's economic standing, to try to help them get higher education that might lead to other types of work, to encourage them to join the Great Migration, to move to somewhere where they would not be working as cotton sharecroppers and accumulating debt. To become an African-American minister trained by the Southern Presbyterian Church was to be expected to make a balancing act, to find some way to establish a church, find some way to keep that church financially stable, while also not getting much financial support from the denomination, and being expected to continue the same types of underpaid, very strenuous manual labor that most Black Southerners were forced to participate in during the late 19th century, going well into the 20th century. We learn about the US cotton economy as part of a distinctive cultural difference between the US South and the North with industry. I'm going to challenge your perception of that just for a few more minutes by encouraging you to look at this slide and also think of it as part of our international story for tonight. That the strategies that were used to encourage and compel African Americans to continue working in cotton fields in the US South were being looked at by European leaders abroad. They wanted to find ways to adapt those strategies in order to boost the economies of growing European colonies on the African continent. So the economic status of African Americans in the US South became very, very important to the expected future of Africans and to their prospects for having some control, some future leadership, some prospects for professional education. So as we turn to this quote from W.E.B. Du Bois, we find him thinking about the exploitative economy that I've just described. He calls it the economic situation, the situation of African Americans mostly being stuck in a debt-ridden system, a system that is designed to keep them stuck in manual labor, in underpaid, if they are paid at all, positions, to give them very little prospect of upward mobility, of gaining generational wealth. Du Bois is known as the leader who promoted classical education. This quote from The Souls of Black Folks is to help you remember what classical education meant to him, why he thought talking about education was an important way to talk about Christian justice. So just to highlight a few parts of the quote here. In order to find a solution to the exploitation, the economic situation, Du Bois argued in The Souls of Black Folks that the country needed trained Negro leaders of character and intelligence. And he specified the categories he had in mind: college-educated men, captains of industry, and our focus for tonight, missionaries of culture. He thought that the combination of professionalism coming from Black business leaders, Black educators, and Black people with degrees, and also African-American missionaries within the US and abroad, that combination could help provide the strategies, the tools that could lead the rest of the African-American population out of this exploitation that lingered after the end of slavery. And then to draw your attention to his last point, that combination could only truly work. He only expected exploitation along racial lines to really be challenged if African-American leaders were gaining some power. And I believe he specifically is thinking about political and social power. So for the next 3 slides, I'm going to introduce you to some of the missionaries who I've spent the past 16 years getting to know through my academic research. And I'm going to explain how they fit into Du Bois's definition of a missionary of culture. We start with the Reverend William Henry Shepherd, and I'm very happy to see that we have in the audience tonight the current pastor of the Reverend Shepherd's Church in Louisville, Kentucky. So many greetings to you, Reverend Johnson. William Henry Shepherd was from Virginia, and in 1891, he co-founded the American Presbyterian Congo Mission. This was the first Southern Presbyterian mission to include a team that was racially integrated. William Henry Shepherd co-founded it with a younger minister named Samuel Lapsley, who was white and from Selma, Alabama. Shepherd was by far the most famous African-American Presbyterian missionary. He acquired that fame through becoming the type of missionary of culture who was an explorer, who learned other languages, and also generally just carried with him the spirit of adventure. He was the first Westerner to enter the Kuba Kingdom, a very reclusive African nation in central Congo. He was welcomed as part of the royal court, and he became lifelong friends with the prince of the Kuba Kingdom This is Prince Maxamalinge. William Shepherd even named his son after Prince Maxamalinge. We're going to hear more about Reverend Shepherd later in the talk, but the status that Shepherd gained by exploring, by finding new kingdoms and new places, by creating a separate mission station completely under his management. This is part of what made him one of the two most famous African-American men in the world by the turn of the 20th century. And that fame was valuable to a civil rights leader like W.E.B. Du Bois, because Shepherd was showing the possibilities for what African-Americans could possibly achieve when they're recognized as professionals and when they have some power. I'm also happy to see that we have in the audience representatives of the Mariah Fearing Fund. So I'm happy to talk about Miss Mariah Fearing tonight. I first got into this topic learning about the Presbyterian missionaries because I was told to specifically research the life of Mariah Fearing and to make sure that there would be more publications about her. Miss Mariah Fearing, Miss Mariah Fearing is pictured on the left with the wide hat with the band on it, looking towards us. And the other missionary is her friend, Lillian Thomas, who became Lillian Thomas D. Yampert. Mariah Fearing and Lillian Thomas represent the type of missionaries of culture who specialized in domesticity. They started a foster home together called the Pantops Foster Home. Mariah Fearing funded it with her own savings. She sold her house in Alabama and bought a one-way ticket, used the rest of her money to rescue orphan children who were being sold in the internal slave trade of the Congo Free State. She established a separate village for them, called it the Pantops Foster Home. And Miss Fearing and Lillian Thomas, they raised these mostly girls into adulthood. They trained them to become wives of Presbyterian ministers. They trained them in the skills that Mariah Fearing had gained as a domestic servant in the United States. She trained them to sew, to clean. This was part of what was called at the time woman's work for woman. And by making domesticity the cornerstone of her ministry, Mariah Fearing was making her claim to being a respectable professional, someone who deserved to be part of the mission. That making that claim was especially important for her because she was the oldest person to join the Presbyterian Congo Mission. She joined in 1894. And for the first 2 years, she was on a trial period, considered not quite worthy to be officially called a Presbyterian missionary until she showed just how much of an asset she was to the mission, and she did by far. She worked there for 20 years with Lillian Thomas by her side. Our final set of missionaries that I'm going to introduce you to as examples of missionaries of culture. Althea Brown and her husband, Alonzo Edmiston, met in the Congo Free State in 1904, and they married in 1905. They were the second generation of African-American missionaries to go to Congo. And they were very conscious about considering themselves professionals. Alonzo Edmiston graduated from the Southern Presbyterian Seminary for African-American ministers. Althea Brown was valedictorian with a classics degree from Fisk University, specializing in Greek and Latin. they understood their mission careers as being about professional achievements, that Althea Brown was going to publish the first dictionary of a relatively unknown African language. Alonzo Edmiston would create agricultural innovations. He would experiment with local plants, and he'd continue the kind of work that he had observed George Washington Carver doing during the time that Alonzo Edmiston was training at Tuskegee Institute. So their status as professionals was part of what specifically plugged them into W.E.B. Du Bois's vision, that they thought of themselves as part of the talented 10th, that they could possibly make the lives of local people better as they settled in Congo through their skills. So those missionaries are our guides as we move forward to talk about the biggest social justice controversy of the Congo Free State. The Congo Free State is notorious now as the setting for the first global human rights campaign. It's been featured in a best-selling book called King Leopold's Ghost. But the campaign really first started getting major recognition because of the book to the right. It's called Red Rubber, the story of the rubber slave trade on the Congo. It was written by E.D. Morel, who was a British activist who worked with an international team that included leaders of the American Presbyterian Congo Mission in their efforts to get King Leopold II of Belgium to give up sole control of the Congo. The reasons why they wanted him to give up sole control had to do with the fact that back in the mid-1880s, King Leopold had depicted himself as a humanitarian. And he had argued that it was his humanitarian duty to claim control over Central Africa, and that under his control, he was going to bring in companies that would help civilize and bring culture to these African people who otherwise had seen very few Westerners. Under that guise of doing humanitarian outreach, King Leopold divided up Congo into different regions controlled by rubber companies. These rubber companies did anything and everything to force people to harvest rubber 24 hours a day. By anything, I mean, they would torture people. They would burn down villages. They would maim people by cutting off hands. And then the colonial soldiers would deliver those hands to another village and argue, this is what will happen to you if you don't send people with us to do more work, to harvest more rubber. The Congo Free State rubber economy produced great wealth for King Leopold, and there's still signs of that great wealth in Belgium today. It was only in the late 1890s when the fame of that great wealth started to be outbalanced by the notoriety of how much violence was actually happening, was being caused by colonial soldiers in Congo. The campaign to promote change in the Congo Free State was successful, but I'm leaving it a more open question through the rest of our discussion of what it meant to actually find justice in Congo. So for the next slides, you have the question justice matched with different interpretations of how the missionaries in my work were trying to find this principle, trying to ensure that their careers would leave the Belgian Congo in a better place than it was in the 1890s. So by far the most famous incidents in the history of the American Presbyterian Congo Mission revolved around the participation in the human rights campaign of two of the main supervisors, William Morrison, here on the left, and Reverend William Henry Shepherd. They participated in the human rights campaign from the 1890s up to 1909, when King Leopold finally gave up control. The men featured in this photograph, they traveled together from the Congo Mission Station to Leopoldville with the intent to testify about abuses in the regional villages, the villages around the mission station. Most of these men are citizens of the Kuba Kingdom, an African nation that was within central Congo and had resisted colonialism longer than most other parts of the country. The Reverend Shepherd had been instructed by the Reverend Morrison to find evidence that abuses were taking place around the Congo Mission, that people were being terrorized or forced to work or even killed. So Reverend Shepherd marched through the Kuba Kingdom, sometimes in the company of some of these men, and he took photographs of several atrocities. Because Morrison had already been working with British activists in the human rights campaign, he helped to circulate those photographs to make sure that they would be publicized by the Presbyterian Church and later circulated by international press. But then the Belgian government sued Shepherd and Morrison for libel, arguing that this was bad publicity and that it was inaccurate. Shepherd asked these African men to go to Leopoldville and stand with him to try to win the libel suit, and they were successful. The eventual dismissal of this case, it hastened the removal of Leopold II as sole ruler of the Congo Free State. Some estimates are that by ending his sole control, they may have saved thousands, possibly millions of lives by participating in this campaign. The campaign and the success in the trial, it also became a cornerstone in how the Reverend Shepherd discussed missions and justice. According to his biographer, William Phipps, Shepherd recalled his acquittal in the 1909 trial as a victory, quote, for those in the American government who have fought for justice, for those in various Christian denominations who have taken the deepest interest in us possible, and for those in the PCUS, or Southern Presbyterian Church, whose holy and high mission has always been to feed the hungry, clothe the naked, and to succor the distressed. Shepherd's interpretation of justice combined biblical principles of provision, along with openness to political intervention on behalf of oppressed people. And his sentiments represented a shift among Southern Presbyterian leaders away from those former strict dichotomies between spiritual and secular pursuits. By celebrating Southern Presbyterian links to a transnational political effort against colonial atrocities, Shepherd and Morrison made it seem justifiable or even expected that their formerly Confederate denomination would show public opposition to forced labor. So our first strategy involved political intervention. Our second strategy focuses on education. I knew about the atrocities in the Congo Free State before I started specific research on Congo missionaries, but I was unaware of the ways that colonial abuses persisted even after King Leopold ceded control to the Belgian government. The rubber harvesting economy declined as the focus shifted to cotton agriculture, mining, and construction. Various violent and exploitative strategies were used to compel most of the African population in Congo to participate in these types of work. And even the Congo Mission had hoped to start its own Southern-style cotton plantation within central Congo. What constituted justice in an economic context where everyone, regardless of age or gender, was expected to perform manual labor? Althea Brown and Alonzo Edmiston expected that justice, or at least results leading up to justice, could come from ensuring that students and community members had more say in the results of their work. The boys pictured here, they were enrolled in the mission boarding school that Alonzo Edmiston supervised in the 1930s. And you see these knives and digging tools because they were required to line up every morning with the tools that were assigned to them, because every student was assigned to work in the mission station fields between the time that they went to chapel and the time that they took classes. Edmiston supervised their farm work without being assigned to teach classes on a regular basis. And that led him to worry that his ministry role had become too circumscribed by farm demands. Likewise, he wished that the boys would have less required work time in the fields, especially when teachers would give them extra farm duties as demerits, as a form of punishment. Althea Brown, she tried to ameliorate this situation. She coordinated other activities for the students. She encouraged them to plan weekly storytelling and drama presentations. She invited the rest of the community, people from the villages, to come watch the dramas. She trained African singers who learned translated Negro spirituals, and they toured around the region in the style of the Fisk Jubilee Singers, the group that Althea had been part of in college. But these edifying, these entertaining activities, they didn't change the daily reality of manual labor requirements within and outside the mission stations. Since the 1880s, all missions in Congo, regardless of their affiliation or their Catholic or Protestant identity, had relied, at least in part, on the work of African children for food and for domestic service. Practical needs had precluded any reliable trend towards human rights reform being defined as a refusal to have children and youth work in the Belgian Congo. But when the Edmistons planned their own short-lived agricultural college, they strategized that the students would work, but their work would be organized in ways that broadened their skill set and increased their options for more lucrative and desirable clerical work in a major city. That's why the Edmistons designed a curriculum that combined vocational and agricultural work with classical and liberal arts training, including learning French, which was very unusual for a mission school, and learning math and budgeting. They also planned to invite regional chiefs for annual Jubilee events that involved sharing folklore and history and discussing mutual goals for the future. The missionaries' plans were cut short by the consequences of the Great Flu pandemic of 1918. The Edmistons decided to relocate their school to protect the students' health, but they also lost a harvest in the process. The fact that they considered that trade-off worthwhile may be the strongest statement from Althea Brown and Alonzo Edmiston that they found justice in making vocational learning environments safer for local children. Our third strategy from the Congo Mission involves some Dixieland music. This is a photograph of a Dixieland brass band at one of the Congo Mission stations, and it shows a fascinating cultural combination. African-American and white missionaries in pith helmets, mostly on the left side, are posing alongside local Africans. Most of them are wearing Western style identical dresses and pants that were provided by the missionaries. And a few of them are wearing local style clothing. This scene is just a part of the American Southern aesthetic that was typical for Congo mission stations. The Ibank mission station was known as a place that had wide avenues and gardens and houses with wraparound porches. The idea of making Southern music and design such a prominent part of Presbyterian ministry, that was an aspect of acculturation, which was a major theme in the history of missions. Could acculturation become a strategy for promoting justice? In the earlier quote from Du Bois, I mentioned his enthusiasm for missionaries of culture whose influence would help to shape societies and economic futures. Reverend Shepherd and his Presbyterian colleagues, they embraced that interpretation of their goals by introducing African children and adults to Southern traditions. By extension, African-American missionaries used photographs like this one to send back to the United States as evidence of their abilities to conduct civilizing missions, to teach and to model American ideals in an era when their level of American citizenship was circumscribed by Jim Crow discrimination. Scholars' evaluations of the civilizing missions process have become more critical since Du Bois's assessment. The history of missions overall has become associated closely with the legacies of imperialism, and post-colonial scholarship has shifted more focus to evidence of leadership, initiatives, and traditions that originated with Africans. The theologian Lamin Sana expanded this academic approach with his theories about indigenization as a crucial part of how Christian faith develops. And I've learned a lot about theological approaches to this topic from Dr. Sana. One of the things I learned had to do with his theories of indigenization. He theorized that the process of making Christian faith local, translating it into a local context, local language, this was an absolute inseparable part of how the Christian faith developed in mission context, but also since the beginning of Christianity, that Christianity could only grow through indigenization. To apply this theory from Dr. Sana to the scene from the Congo Mission that I have pictured here is to argue that cultural displays reminiscent of the US South amplified the interest of American missionaries because these American missionaries felt that they needed visual evidence of their progress. But these visual markers of acculturation did not necessarily advance or hinder the growth of Christianity in Congo. Because according to Dr. Sana's theories of world Christianity, the faith was going to grow in Congo because of the people on the right side of the picture, because of how local people, how the Africans chose to interpret Christianity in their local African way. But this can still be considered a justice issue because the diasporic connections that were forged between African Presbyterians who were devoting time to shared cultural activities with African American Presbyterians, that mutual regard, the time spent, the cooperation, that may have laid the groundwork for a sense of common purpose and for later social justice appeals. So last example of a justice appeal is bringing us up to the 1930s. In the final decade of his service in the Belgian Congo, Alonzo Edmiston argued that church members should be encouraged to tithe with produce rather than being asked to donate to the church with Belgian francs or with other types of currency. This tithing system provided an alternative way to remain in good standing without earning cash through exploitative manual labor for the colonial government. In that political context, tithing with produce was a form of political and social justice, and it was motivated by the interests and enthusiasm of local people maybe you can tell some of them really do look particularly happy to bring the best from their gardens as a gift to the church. But here's the complication. Edmiston, the missionary, started micromanaging the process. He wanted to set the values for how much ministers could count as a donation for certain types of vegetables. He wanted the African pastors to contribute as well, and to not take too much of a cut from the proceeds, even though they were the official pastors of the church. So could progress towards justice be achieved if local leaders were undercut? That question of balancing indigenous leaders' authority with the authority of Western missionaries was a linchpin in World War I era theories of the three selves. Three selves meaning that missions would hypothetically and hopefully found congregations that were self-supporting, self-governing, and self-propagating. The Reverend W. Don McClure, the namesake for this lecture series, he specialized in establishing such churches in East Africa between 1938 and the 1950s. The increasing authority of African, Asian, and Latin American pastors and evangelists is recognized among the major steps towards religious and political independence in formerly colonized nations. But the fraught negotiations between Alonzo Edmiston and the African pastors involved with what became the Congo Presbyterian Church, it complicates the narratives of how indigenous church leadership developed. Edmiston argued that it was just to provide the most generous means for local parishioners to contribute financially, and African pastors argued that it was unjust for this African-American missionary to set the limits for how they would manage their own congregations and their own budgets. So I have given you different strategies without coming down on a specific common answer to what is Christian justice. In true historian style, I'm not going to try to give you one solution or one answer or one definition. I want to emphasize the stakes of asking this question. Because if it wasn't considered pressing, if it wasn't considered something that had to be thought of on a regular basis, something that was a matter of constant concern for the church, then silence or postponement, disregard could lead to exploitation running amok, going too far. And the example that I use for that is always the Big Hole diamond mine of South Africa. This is a picture of the city of Kimberly, South Africa. The Big Hole is 1,500 feet in diameter, about 800 feet deep. It is the only man-made hole visible in space. This was how the De Beers Diamond Company exploited South Africans. And it continued in part because the local Christian missions said that they were in favor of justice, that they supported the social gospel, and they even said that they were against poverty, that they noticed how the exploitation of Black workers in South Africa was promoting social disorder. But they never agreed on short-term solutions to it. They thought that maybe someday there would be a class of Western educated African elite who would deserve citizenship and would find their own answers to making the system better. But in the meantime, this system, even before apartheid, resulted in 50,000 men getting sick and some losing their lives, digging an 800-foot deep hole with nothing but the power in their backs and a shovel. I'm going to leave you this evening by taking the story to Selma, Alabama, and introducing you to Miss Amelia Boynton Robinson. During their last furlough vacation from the Belgian Congo, Althea Brown and Alonzo Edmiston stayed as guests in the home of Amelia Boynton. And because of her hospitality, the Edmistons became part of a professional tradition in the Boyntons' unofficial embassy, a tradition that provided hospitality to African-American missionaries, to African international students, to civil rights leaders, including Dr. King, and to academic experts, including George Washington Carver. What these guests had in common was that they had been able to make a lifestyle out of being professionals. And the Boyntons wanted to make that lifestyle seem more possible for their neighbors. They knew that the lingering cotton economy in Selma was a threat to that. They knew that sharecroppers around Selma were isolated and in debt. They knew that their neighbors in the city had no political representation, very few citizenship rights, that they were segregated and mostly disregarded. That's why Amelia Boynton started in the 1930s hosting meetings in her home and encouraging people to register to vote. Her work came to fruition with the mass protest for voting rights in 1965 that became notorious on Bloody Sunday in March 1965, when Amelia Boynton Robinson was attacked by a state trooper and knocked unconscious on Edmund Pettus Bridge. Shock at the troopers' reactions to nonviolent protesters, it compelled the federal government to hasten the passage of the Voting Rights Act. And the Selma Civil Rights Campaign, it remains memorable as a flashpoint that inspired solidarity among ministers of various faiths and denominations. It also grew from the long-term organizing efforts of ministers that included the Reverend John Lewis, pictured in the front. The decision that many ministers made to visit Selma and to march with the protesters, it represented a mass statement that racially motivated violence was a social problem with spiritual ramifications. That statement did not end all further attacks on ministers committed to the civil rights movement. One Episcopalian minister was actually murdered in Selma shortly after the march. The statement from these ministers also didn't imply that all American Christians had agreed on a unified definition of Christian justice. That search for a definition remains unresolved. But what can be argued from the historical record is that the publicity of violent scenes has drawn attention to longer, less obvious patterns of exploitation. And the publicity of racial violence, including incidents in Selma, Alabama, and the Congo Free State, and incidents from 2020, that publicity continues to make viewers uncomfortable. The steps towards strategizing for Christian justice start with recognizing that discomfort can be a motivation to change the status quo. Thank you, and I'll be happy to hear your comments and questions.
Thank you so much for your presentation. It's certainly given a lot of food for thought as you're placing these parallel experiences alongside each other. We're getting a number of questions that have to do with the apparent inconsistency or irony of the Southern Presbyterian Church being the religious home of many of these missionaries, and yet it was the church that's schismed because of its stance on slavery. So could you please talk a little bit about how this sort of double consciousness might have impacted the missionaries as they went to Africa?
I'll start first by talking about the ways that it was not an irony, that it was intentional. The Southern Presbyterian Church in the United States, was hoping to establish an African mission based on its traditions. And its traditions included confidence that life in the US South had prepared Southern Presbyterians to be exceptionally good at supervising people of African descent. When the Congo Mission was founded, there was an expectation that Samuel Lapsley, the younger minister, would be the supervisor, and William Henry Shepherd would be his support staff. But Lapsley got sick very early on, and he died, leaving Shepherd as the supervisor of the Congo Mission, the person who was going to recruit additional workers. He came back to the US and did a tour of historically Black colleges, recruited African Americans to join him. The process of working for the Southern Presbyterian Church was considered a valuable opportunity because Reverend Shepherd was the one doing the recruiting. And he had created the Ebonk mission station. He had created this vision of a Black supervised mission that was going to create a world, a home for Black people. That it would show them making achievements. It would show them doing diplomacy, gaining the respect of an African kingdom, and becoming experts in explaining the culture and language of that kingdom to the rest of the world. So for them, part of working for the Southern Presbyterian Church was being isolated in that vision created by Reverend Shepherd. After Reverend Shepherd left Congo and the church started focusing much more on recruiting only white missionaries going further after 1920, then the balancing act did become more complicated, and Alonzo Edmiston especially became more vocal about his concerns about discrimination on the mission station.
One of our viewers has asked that it would seem surprising that the Southern Presbyterian Church would create integrated missionary teams after departing over the issue of slavery from the Presbyterian Church. Is this a historical anomaly?
It is unusual. There were other mission stations on the African continent that did involve white and African American ministers. Some of them British, some of them American. This was the only one from the Southern Presbyterian Church. It makes more sense logistically if we remember it being a matter of practical necessity, that the white missionaries who were sent as reinforcements for Samuel Lapsley after he died, at first they tended to leave very early as well. And the onus was on Reverend Shepherd and his team from Black colleges to become the main staff of the mission.
Following on this, were the white and Black missionaries paid equally for their work in Africa?
As far as I've been able to tell from the records, I can say that there was equal pay, and also that there was equality in terms of professional titles. So the African American missionaries were called Mr. and Mrs. or Miss in the case of Mariah Fearing, which was unusual for American Southerners in the early 20th century or late 19th. The question of how integrated the the mission was. That gets a bit more complicated. I can say from reading specifically about Mariah Fearing that she based most of her career on time spent at the oldest Congo mission station, which meant that between Mariah Fearing and Lillian Thomas and Lillian Thomas's husband, they were making sure that that station was consistently racially integrated, that Black and white missionaries were seeing each other on a regular basis.
The story of Mariah Fearing has captured the imagination of some of our friends here. How did she first hear about the plight of the children she ended up fostering? That's a pretty drastic move, to sell everything and buy a one-way ticket to a place you've never been to before, a place that is so different from anything you're accustomed to.
It was a drastic move. She had also lived through drastic times. She was born enslaved on a plantation in Alabama. And every step that she made towards having an independent life and a career, it came from her taking risks and committing to long-term choices. So the way that she got involved in becoming a foster mother started with that kind of taking risks. She had already paid for herself to get to Congo, and she just started observing, looking to see where the needs might be. She observed local mercenaries traveling past the Congo mission station with lines of people in collars and chains being carted off to work in the rubber fields. And she started approaching the mercenaries and asking them what she could do to free the children. Whatever price they said, she would barter whatever she had left, and she started getting a family.
Yeah. It's hard not to draw a connection between her observation of the enslaved peoples going off to mine red rubber and her own memory of her experience in the pre-Civil War South. It seems that there would have been a deep connection there for her.
I think there was a deep connection to her memories of being enslaved when she was young. And I just noticed a message from one of our attendees, Miss Deborah Love, that she was enslaved on a plantation in Gainesville, Alabama. Thank you. I think her preparation for that work also came from attending and working at Talladega College, where if you were going to be part of the community of a Black college, you had to be prepared to do anything to help it survive. She observed what her fellow students needed. She noticed when they were having problems in the dorm. She figured out some way to fundraise for the college, to provide better food, all of that while having very few resources herself.
What was the end of the foster home that she created for these children? What was the historical trajectory of it? Is there any remnant of it still around today?
The remnant of the Pantops home survives in some of the alums. So at least one graduate of Mariah Fearing's home is still living and is still active in the Presbyterian Church of the Congo. And there was a book about her life that was published recently. I'm sorry that I don't remember the title, but the co-author's name is Elsie McKee. So if you want to learn about the long-term history of the Pantops home, look up a book by Elsie McKee that has to do with Congo. Some of the women graduated, married ministers, and remained active with the church.
Mhm.
And church members are now working with the descendants of the Congo Mission to fund ongoing service projects.
Mhm.
The difference this time is that the service projects originate with the local people, and the Americans, they offer sometimes in-person visits, mostly local fundraising here in the US.
Mhm. Going back to changing direction a little bit, going back to the breadcrumb you dropped with the quote from W.B. Du Bois, what were the consequences of that classical education that were given by the Edmistons? Was there any unintentional consequence in terms of the impact on the Congolese and their culture?
I have thought a lot about the consequence of classical education on Althea Brown and Alonzo Edmiston by making them better listeners, by giving them an incentive to pay attention to what the local people wanted and what the local people considered threatening about the colonial era. I think an impact that it had as well on local people was making sure that that their stories would be recognized, and that the time they needed to be able to share stories would be recognized. So I don't credit Althea Brown with being the first or only person to encourage children in Congo to tell stories or to write plays, but making sure that the mission made time for them to do that every Friday night was a way to signal to all the surrounding villages that this is going to be a place where Westerners are saying that what we feel is important about ourselves is worth expressing, and that they're going to make time to actually listen to it. That tradition could have been part of what later led African pastors to start claiming more time to speak and more authority within the Congo Mission. So part of the step towards them becoming an independent church and being ready to keep that church operating after the founding of the Democratic Republic of the Congo and after the Congo Mission officially shut down.
I'm sure it's easy for people with a post-colonial critique of missions to sort of look at the story that you're talking about here and see places where there were Western colonial values that were brought over to Africa. What is your own thought about these post-colonial critiques that one might make of the work that was done by these missionaries from the US who were seeking this professional life they apparently did not have access to in quite the same way back in the United States?
I agree with most of the scholarship that analyzes African American missionaries, particularly from in that first generation, 1880s up to 1920s in Central and West Africa, those who have been analyzed as promoting acculturation and thereby criticized heavily for that, for not showing much regard for local cultures and for actively trying to change people's ways of lives. I acknowledge that was happening. Part of what motivates me in my scholarship is to argue that there are other questions that can also be asked. So I seek through my through my research and through the time I've spent traveling to different places where these missionaries lived, to try to understand them as ministers, as they saw themselves,
Mhm,
but also to understand them as part of their historical context,
mhm,
and to understand that their perspectives were not the only ones at play.
Yeah.
That through their records, I can also start to get a sense of what local African people wanted, and then also maybe notice where the missionaries weren't catching on, that there were bigger trends that were beyond whether or not somebody was dressed in a way that seemed appropriate from Western
Mhm.
standards.
mhm. We've just gotten this question that concerning your history that you've laid out for us. The history seems to conjure up the two faces of Christian religion. On the one hand, it pacifies the masses and quiets them, and theologically justifies their exploitation. And then the other one is the more disruptive face of Christianity, the one that moves people and churches to question and resist and proclaim justice. How do you see that same dynamic playing out in the United States civil rights movement?
Could you repeat it for me?
It seems that the history that you have shared with us this evening conjures up the two faces of Christian religion. On the one hand, it can pacify people, pacify the masses, and it can theologically justify their exploitation as a disruptive face of Christianity, and justify their exploitation, excuse me. And on the other hand, there's the disruptive face of Christianity, the one that moves people and churches to question, to resist, to proclaim justice. We saw both of those kinds of dynamics in the history that you shared with us. Do we see the same theme in the United States civil rights period?
I see some signs of that theme.
Mm-hmm.
And my brain is switching gears a bit to think about my civil rights classes as I answer this question. Their church participation in the civil rights movement can be thought about in terms of ministers who were participating in marches or boycotts. We can also think about those who participated through more silent things, such as an African-American visitor in the congregation, and they either do or do not make a statement about it. Or the question of whether or not the church would allow for a private school to start on its grounds that just happened to open around the time of Brown versus Board of Education. The growth of churches that were helping people leave inner cities during the era of desegregation, or the growth of churches that were sponsoring private schools that would unofficially continue school segregation. I see those as elements of the faith being used in ways that could involve avoiding issues, possibly attempts to pacify the masses, or to make it more practical, take the jargon out of it, to give people a place to hide, and in hopes that the topic might blow over. I brought up discomfort at the end because I recognize that those kinds of silent strategies were comforting to many people, that it didn't require specific conscious thought to just get enthusiastic about the fact that your church just suddenly has a private school now, or to just not need to look behind and notice that the ushers had escorted out a Black visitor. Those who participated actively in the protest were always the minority. And that dichotomy isn't fully explained or bridged since even in this later stage of the civil rights movement.
Mhm. Is there a lesson from this history that you would want our participants this evening to leave this evening with, maybe to return to their home church, thinking about, chewing on, strategizing with?
The lesson that most came to mind for me had to do with taking a minute to really feel uncomfortable.
Mhm.
And maybe in the course of some of these stories I've shared tonight, to really feel some grief, some pain. So if you have an emotional reaction to hearing about people being tortured to force them to work in the rubber fields, to memories of Bloody Sunday, and to the people like Amelia Boynton Robinson and John Lewis who were hurt on that day. If you have emotional reactions to any of the stories involving people who have died in police custody over the past year and a half, my lesson is just to encourage you to take that emotional reaction seriously, in the sense of thinking that discomfort isn't meant to be resolved quickly, that discomfort might be a sign that there's something broader, something long-term that needs to be questioned and changed.
Mhm.
And quick resolutions, a desire for calm may not lead to things getting better.
No, it serves to mitigate the uncomfortable feelings of those people who are uncomfortable when they wake up to the occasion of injustice that you're talking about. It doesn't resolve the injustice. It placates the feeling.
The more specifics about what to change and how to change, that's outside my lane as a historian.
Thank you so much for sharing this story with us. It's been a really rich experience, the historical narrative, and you invite us at the very end to think about what this means now, especially as you began with the Black Lives Matter movement, and what role, given the fact that you left a rose at St. John's Episcopal Church, what role does the church have in working towards and determining what justice needs to look like in this time? Thank you so much for being with us, Dr. Hill. I want to make sure that everybody knows we've got part 2 coming up next week, same time, same Zoom channel. And between now and then, we will capture some of the resources that have been put in the chat pod, including Dr. Elsie McKee's book, which Hunter Farrell has looked up for us, and we'll let you know what those references are in case you want to do any further digging. So thank you, Dr. Hill. Next week, we'll be in conversation with our president, the Reverend Dr. Asa Lee, as they reckon with invisibility, African-American missionaries and their hidden legacies, talking about the stories that are frequently not told in the dominant historical narratives that are shared. Remind everybody too, some of the other events coming up as part of our October Hearing History, Seeing Activism Month. We have a Metro Urban Institute Symposium on Urban Artistry, Aesthetics, and Social Ministry on October 21st at 1 o'clock Eastern, followed in the evening by a Wise Women presentation with Janelle Austin, who's an anti-racism activist and the caretaker of George Floyd Square in Minneapolis. She's the one who's taking care of the site and teaching people how to be pastorally present in what has become a de facto outdoor cathedral for many and site of pilgrimage. We also have a Kelso Museum lecture on October 27th called The Risks and Rewards of Archaeology as Activism. For a full schedule, once again, go to www.pts.edu or make sure you grab somebody with one of these t-shirts, and the full schedule is on the back. Thank you again, Dr. Hill, for joining us. We're really grateful for you sharing your wisdom and your insight, and we look forward to seeing you next week.
Thank you, everyone. Good
Thank
night.